Tell me if you've heard this before. Blank is not a religion, it's a cult. People have filled in this blank with all types of groups, whether Scientology, Wicca, some people have even put Mormonism in this category. In fact, many new religious movements that have popped up in the past 100 or 200 years have been accused of being a cult. But this is a problematic way to think about religious groups, because cult is not a neutral academic term. It's a term that people use to accuse groups that they think are deviant, fringe, or illegitimate. Given enough time, cults have an uncanny ability to eventually be considered a religion by the broader public as they become more socially acceptable. So even though the old joke that cult plus time equals religion is true on one level or another, the scholar of new religious movements, Dr. Megan Goodwin, puts it a little better. Cults equals any religion I don't like. My fellow YouTuber Tirza Chesky has already gone over this topic at her channel Ground Up Religion, so if you're interested, go check that out. I'm going to approach this topic from a slightly different angle. How has the term cult been used? And should we ever use this term to describe small sectarian religious groups? The word cult comes from the Latin cultus, which basically refers to a sense of worship, reverence, or cherishing. We see this in other English words like cultivate or agriculture. And ancient historians today often use this term in this ancient sense. So when we talk about the cult of Mithras, we're referring to the veneration of the god Mithras. When we say the imperial cult in the Roman Empire, we're talking about the veneration of the emperor as a god. The ancient historian and one of my personal heroes, Peter Brown, even wrote a book called The Cult of the Saints, where he explores the development of Christian veneration of certain godly humans like Saint Simeon, and how people built up shrines to venerate these saints and their relics. In this sense, ancient historians use it all the time as an adjective. So sacrificing to the goddess Artemis could be called cult practice. The image of Artemis inside her temple is called the cult image. This term cult is just referring to the institutional veneration of the goddess Artemis. But this sense of the word doesn't have any of the modern connotations. It's not referring to small sectarian groups because the imperial cult was a huge empire-wide institution. And it's not referring to groups with a single authoritarian leader. And it certainly doesn't have any of the pejorative connotations of religious deviancy. So in my recent video on the cult of Mithras, people were asking me, why are you using this term? It's not a neutral academic term. But I'm an ancient historian by training, so it was completely uncontroversial for me to say the cult of Mithras. I just hang out with a lot of ancient historians. But what about the modern sense? A lot of people use the term cult today to refer to small groups that they see as exploitive, abusive, with a slavish devotion to an authoritarian leader, and extreme examples like this do exist. The People's Temple founded by Jim Jones immediately comes to mind. Jones's sect famously led to the mass suicide at Jonestown in 1978, or the Japanese religious group Aum Shinrikyo, which carried out a nerve gas attack at a Tokyo subway station in 1995. Now, these are some really scary examples, but even for these groups, I wouldn't use the word cult. I would say religious group, or apocalyptic religious group that carried out a nerve gas attack. The instant that we use the word cult, we're joining a non-academic discourse that's labeling certain religious groups as legitimate and other ones as illegitimate, while at the same time lumping in other new religious movements along with these violent examples. Spoiler alert, not all new religious movements are apocalyptic. Not all small new religious movements are violent. To illustrate this point, I'm going to use some examples from the historian Philip Jenkins. But first of all, I want you to ask, what do you mean when you use the word cult? If cult means groups that are ideologically sectarian and controlling of their members' behavior, why don't we count the Amish or Hasidic Jews as cults, who are by definition insular groups with strict behavioral expectations? I can't think of anyone that refers to the Amish as a cult. If by cult we mean religious groups that are violent or involved with sexual abuse, then that unfortunately will include a lot of religious groups throughout history, small or otherwise. And if by cult we mean groups with beliefs that are outside the mainstream, suddenly we need to ask who's mainstream. The more you look into it, the more you realize that the word cult just is not useful for academic discourse. It just has way too much ideological baggage, and it's too relative. One man's cult is another man's religion. Mormonism is a good example. Many people called it a cult in its early years, and many people still do. But Mormonism is now a global religion with millions of followers. Some are even calling it the New World Religion. Even Billy Graham, the famous evangelical preacher, removed Mormonism from his official list of cults when Mitt Romney ran for president back in 2012, bringing Mormonism to the center stage spotlight. So if cult is a concept that is just so changeable and so wrapped up with personal ideologies, why use it at all? Well, as it turns out, scholars of these types of religious groups don't use this term at all. They use the term new religious movements. New religious movements are diverse and they're small, but they are genuine religions. And you might think they're weird or eccentric, but it's best to keep a level head and assume a neutral stance when you study them. Because portraying new religious movements as freaks and irrational weirdos has actual real-life consequences. A lot of these groups have suffered persecution throughout the past 100 years during so-called cult scares. So next time you hear someone use the word cult, you can ask yourself, are they using it to label some group as weird or deviant? Are they using it just to describe a new religious movement? Or maybe they're just talking about the cult of Mithras. As always, thanks for watching. There are some great resources on the topic of new religious movements, and I have barely scratched the surface, so check out the bibliography in the description below. This episode was brought to you by our amazing patrons on Patreon that keep the show afloat financially. If you'd like to support us, even just a few bucks a month, click on the Patreon logo and head over to the site. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.